prayers for me. I obviously wasn't here last week because I was quite sick, and I'm feeling much, much better, although, you know, the last stages of it are still kind of in my throat here, so bear with me. I may drink a little more water than usual to get it going. But I'd like to start today with a thought experiment, and I hope you'll engage in this thought experiment with me. Okay, let's say that you have 10 trees in your backyard. 10 trees, and you know them. They've been there for years and years, and you watch them grow, and you know what kind of tree they are. You know exactly where they are. If it were pitch black out at nighttime, you could walk into your backyard and find any one of those trees because you know exactly where they are so well. One night you fall asleep and you wake up in the morning, and in the morning there is a new tree in your backyard. And not just a little sapling, a full-grown tree. It's the biggest one there. And you have no idea how that tree got there. So you have a couple of options. You could call a scientist over, a botanist, and see what he has to say about how that tree could have possibly grown that large overnight. How could that happen? You're waiting for him to give you the answer that you already know, that it's scientifically impossible. You could do that. Or you could chop the tree down and uproot it and just pretend like it never even happened. Just get back to normal. Or you could see this miraculous event and use it as an opportunity to worship the God of all wonderful miracles. You see, we'll read the story of the wise men today, and they had a similar dilemma. They had a similar choice to make. In the Greek, they're called magi. And essentially what they are is they were the astronomers of the day, although back then they were where they studied the signs and magic and that kind of stuff associated with the stars. But they were really familiar with the stars. They numbered them all. They knew them like you would know those 10 trees in your backyard. And then all of a sudden, one day, a new star pops up in the sky. A new star. And not only a new star, it's a star that's moving in a different direction than any of the other stars in the sky. Now, they could just ignore it. Or they could let it lead them into worship. And it's that second option that they took. They let that miraculous event shake them up enough to follow that star all the way to Bethlehem and worship the newborn king. But now the wise men in this story are not the only ones that you will hear who are shaken. There's another character by the name of Herod, King Herod. He too is shaken in this story. As we read the text, it's going to read that Herod and all Jerusalem were frightened. And that word that's translated as frightened can also be translated, and perhaps should be translated, as shaken. Herod was shaken by the news that there was a new king born in Bethlehem. Under his authority, under his rule. It threatened him. And so Herod has a very different response. If you know the story of Herod, he intends to kill Jesus, not to worship him. So we're going to read this story today and see two different ways that people have been shaken. One leads to worship and one leads to something very different than worship. And my question to you as we read this text, when was the last time that you were shaken? How did you respond when you were shaken? Let's listen. We read from the second chapter of Matthew's Gospel, beginning at the first verse. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem asking, "Where is the child who's been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising and have come to pay him homage." When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all Jerusalem with him. And calling together all the chief priests and the scribes, the people, he inquired of them, "Where is the Messiah to be born?" And they told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it's been written by the prophets. And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod secretly called for the wise men and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. Then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word, so that I may also also go and pay him homage. When they heard the king, they set out there ahead of them with the star that they had seen at its rising, until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw that the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. Entering the house, they saw the child with Mary and his mother, and they knelt down and they paid him homage. And then opening their treasure chests, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I bet there's a saying, and I bet you've heard it, that there's no such thing as an atheist in a foxhole. When shells are falling all around you, when bullets are flying by your head, and you realize that death is imminent, short of a miracle, all of a sudden you begin to pray for that very miracle to a God that you weren't sure even existed before that moment. We are shaking in those moments. And that shakiness even leads us perhaps to worship. But why? I remember before Emma was born, but Brittany was very, very pregnant, about to have Emma. I began to think, can I do this? And I thought, I was raised in a good family with a good father figure. He set a good example for me. I'll follow that example. I think I may have even, read an article or two about parenting, and I thought, I got this. I can handle this. It's going to be a cinch. But let me tell you, when you hear that baby cry, when she takes her first breath, you're shaking at your core and you say, I have no idea what I'm doing. And you begin to pray. And you worship. You're shaking, and that shakenness leads us into a worship. But why? Why do we worship in these moments when we are shaken to our very core? And I think that there are at least two responses. One is that in those scenarios we find ourselves very aware of how precious life is. And not only how precious life is, how very little control we have over life. And so in that helpless state we find ourselves turning to the God who indeed rules over all life. And when we submit ourselves to Him, when we depend completely on Him, in those moments we're in worship. That's what worship means, to depend completely upon God. So I think there is that sense that when we're shaken, we're led into worship. But there is another sense. And I think this is the camp that Herod falls into, but not just Herod. We often find ourselves doing this too. There are some people that when they come to the moments in life when they are absolutely shaken, even shaken to their very core, rather than turn to God to worship Him, they become angry. They become frustrated that things have changed and that they have lost control. And they do turn to God, but not because He's an awesome God. Instead, they turn to God as a means for them to regain control over their own lives. This is what we see Herod doing. And here's what's dangerous. Here's what's dangerous when we do it. It looks like worship, but it's not. Did you remember in the story what the very first thing Herod did when he found out that there was a baby king born? It looked like worship. He called his religious people to him and he said, "What do the scriptures say about the Messiah?" And how many times do we get shaken in our life and not in an effort to worship God, but in an effort to regain control? We go to church and we say, "Pastor, what do the scriptures say I should do?" Just because we want to regain that control over our lives. But it's such a dangerous kind of worship because it kills the very thing that it seeks to worship. Just like Herod, he didn't want to worship Jesus. He wanted to kill him. He represented a threat to his being in control. Now here's a hard truth. I'm going to lay down the gauntlet here. I see the fruits of Herod's false worship in every mainline denomination in this country. In every mainline denomination in this country. Us included. We're declining in numbers, and if we walk into any one of the churches and ask, what's the conversation like? Well, it's like, well, what about this gay marriage? Who's going to be able to control the conversation about how we respond to gay marriage? Or which hymnal should we sing from? Should it be the blue one, or the red one, or maybe the purple one? Maybe that's the hymnal we should sing from. Now. Are we doing things decently and in order? At the next church potluck, who's going to set the table? Well, it depends. Who's going to be elected the new chairman of the table setting committee? And we sit in the back rows of our declining churches, wringing our hands saying, why won't they come into our churches? I'll tell you why. It's because we've made our religion about stupid, fruitless things that have to do with control rather than Jesus. And I'm not just casting stones here, it's me too. I came in here today and we talked about how your kid's doing. We talked about programs to grow the church, websites. We talked about newsletters. You know, the one thing we didn't talk about, I didn't talk about it to any of you. And I'm your pastor. I didn't talk about Jesus Christ, the Savior of my soul. See them out there? They're not coming in here because they don't need us. They don't need us. Them out there, they're broken. And they're hurting. And they're lost. And their marriages are falling apart. And their lives are crumbling before their eyes. And the last thing they need is to come through the door and talk about what color hymnal we're going to sing from. Or who gets to be the chairman of the doodad committee. They don't need us to be in control. They need us to point to the one who is in control. To show them real worship. I hope that shakes you up a little. Maybe you don't even need shaking up. Maybe you're the one that I'm talking about. And you came in here today and you feel like your life is crumbling. Maybe you're shaking. If you are shaking, it's not such a bad position to be in. In fact, it's the very position where we really begin to depend upon God. Where we really begin to worship God. Herod wasn't the only one shaken that day. The wise men were obviously shaken as well. Look at these wise men. All we know is that they came from the east. They may have come from as close as Persia. I say close. That's not exactly close, but that's the closest that would have been called the east. But they may have come from as far away as China. And so that trip took maybe months, maybe years, traveling by camel or horse or foot. And so they had to set aside an entire block of time, months. They had to put their life on hold, cancel everything on their schedule. They either had to pack up their family and take it with them or say, I'll see you in a few months or years. Okay, neither one of those are convenient options. So these wise men had something happen in their life that shook them enough that they were willing to take this journey. To come to Bethlehem and worship a king that they'd never seen before. They were shaken. Another reason we know that they're shaken is that they bring gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. These are not easily obtainable or cheap gifts. It's not as though the wise men found themselves in Bethlehem all of a sudden, and one says to the other, hey, you brought the gifts, right? And he said, no, oh man, I forgot the gifts. Let's run into the Bethlehem CVS and pick up some gold, frankincense, and myrrh. It's just not a gift that works that way. They had to plan for it. They had to be ready for it. They had to invest time and energy in getting these gifts to present to a king that they'd never seen before. Because something is shaken to their very core. These men were astronomers, and God interrupted their careers by putting a star in the sky that they'd never seen before. I wonder what happens if God interrupts our lives like that. What happens if we're sitting in a session meeting, going through the committee reports, and